So let's talk about Donald Trump. Businessman, TV star, president. I mean, no matter what you think of him, it's pretty tough to argue with his impact. The source material we're looking at today really paints this picture of a figure who didn't just, occupy the White House. He fundamentally reshaped American politics. And that's what we're going to break down right now. All right, we're going to start with this quote because, honestly, it gets right to the heart of the whole story. This one claim, which we pulled directly from our source, became this massive focal point for controversy. It really set off a chain of events that, ended up testing the very foundations of American democracy.
So the big question is, right, how do we even get here? Well, to figure that out, we're going to dig into the source material we have and try to understand the man, the president, and of course, the movement he ended up creating.
Okay, here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at his rise from being a New York developer to a reality TV icon. Then we'll dive into his first term in office, all the controversies and the legal battles that came after. We're also going to check out this really unique part of our source that talks about a second term before we wrap things up by trying to define the legacy of Trumpism. All right, let's get right into it. We've got to start at the beginning. Because really, to understand President Trump, you have to first understand the brand that Donald Trump spent decades carefully building. So our source material maps out a pretty clear rise for him. He inherited a real estate empire, and, he stamped his name all over skyscrapers and casinos, but it was television, specifically The Apprentice, that just catapulted his fame to a whole other level. It crafted this incredibly powerful national image of him as the decisive, no-nonsense billionaire who, always wins. And yeah, that image of the self-made man, it gets a bit more complicated when you dig into the details from our source. It points out that he actually inherited a significant amount of wealth. Get this, he was an inflation-adjusted millionaire by the time he was 8 years old. So that financial foundation was absolutely a crucial part of his origin story. But, that image of just constant, nonstop success, well, it wasn't exactly the full picture. The source also points to some pretty major financial setbacks, including 6 corporate bankruptcies. What's really interesting, though, is how he later spun those challenges. He framed them as proof of his resilience, of his ability to use the system to his advantage, and that theme would become totally central to his political identity.
So how did that whole brand translate into politics? Well, when he ran for president, he positioned himself as the ultimate outsider, right? The guy who was there to shake up the establishment. And once he was in the White House, his policies, they aimed to do exactly that.
At home, his agenda was pretty much a direct follow-through on his biggest campaign promises. I'm talking about everything from building a border wall to cutting taxes to appointing conservative judges. All of these actions were specifically designed to energize his base and, really, to fundamentally reshape the role of government. And that same disruptive spirit absolutely defined his foreign policy. Flying under the banner of America First, he pulled the U.S. out of major international agreements on, well, everything, from trade to climate change. This really challenged that whole post-World War II global order and forced both allies and rivals to completely rethink their relationship with America. But of course, policy was only part of the story. His presidency was also just this constant storm of controversy, constantly challenging political norms and leading to some pretty historic confrontations. Yeah, and our source draws a really direct line from his challenge to the 2020 election results all the way to the attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. That day, it became a truly defining and deeply, deeply polarizing moment of his entire presidency. He also made history in another way. Think about this. He's the only U.S. president ever to be impeached twice. The first time was for his dealings with Ukraine, and the second was for his role in the January 6th attack. And even though the Senate acquitted him both times, those trials, they left a permanent mark, for sure. So after he left the White House, the battles didn't stop, not at all. They just moved to a whole new arena, the courtroom. And this set the stage for a series of legal fights that were just completely unprecedented. And this all led to a moment our source calls truly unprecedented. In 2024, a New York jury found him guilty on felony charges, which made him the first former American president in history to be convicted of a crime. Just let that sink in. Our source also highlights this recurring pattern of bold claims versus the documented outcomes. So, for example, take his central campaign promise that Mexico would pay for the border wall. Well, that was a promise that, according to the text, was ultimately funded by U.S. taxpayers.
Okay, and here's a more personal example of that. He often claimed that he graduated at the very top of his class from the Wharton School, but the source we're looking at notes that his name actually doesn't appear on the school's published dean's list. Okay, we're now moving into a very unusual part of our source material. And it's really important to be clear here. This next section is not a prediction. It's a look at a hypothetical second term, as it's described within the document itself, which, and this is key, frames its narrative from a future date. Okay, let's just pause here for a second because this part is critical. The source document we're using is written as if it's from the year 2026, so the events we're about to describe are presented as things that have already happened within that document's fictional timeline. So just to be crystal clear, we are simply reporting on the contents of this speculative text. So inside this hypothetical scenario, the source describes a second term that kicks off with some immediate, really aggressive actions. We're talking a mass firing of federal workers, initiating a near-global trade war, and ordering military interventions that sparked hundreds and hundreds of lawsuits. Okay, putting that whole speculative scenario aside, let's look at the real-world legacy. How does our source actually define his lasting impact on politics? Well, it all seems to come down to one single word: Trumpism. So the source defines Trumpism as way more than just a list of policies. It's this unique blend of populist messaging, a really confrontational leadership style, and that America First agenda that has completely, and I mean completely, reshaped the Republican Party since he first came down that escalator way back in 2015.
And in its final assessment, the source compiles a list of the major criticisms leveled against him. It points to rhetoric that opponents described as divisive, a really high volume of documented false statements, the promotion of conspiracy theories, and actions that were labeled as authoritarian. All of these were factors that led many historians to rank his presidency among the lowest in all of U.S. history.
So in the end, our source leaves us with this portrait of a leader who inspired both incredibly intense loyalty and incredibly fierce opposition. He was a figure who just broke rules, norms, and precedents left and right. So the final question isn't just about how he will be remembered, but really how the political world he completely reshaped will continue to evolve from here.